Chapter 6, Mrs. Arlington. The Honorable Mr. Arthur Chichester had not exaggerated his description of the beauty of the enchantress, for so she was called by the male portion of her admirers. Indeed, she was of exquisite loveliness. Her dark brown hair was arranged en bandeau, and parted over a forehead polished as marble. Her eyes were large and of that soft, dark, melting blue which seems to form a heaven of promises and bliss to gladden the beholder. She was not above the middle height of woman, but her form was modelled to the most exquisite and voluptuous symmetry. Her figure reminded the spectator of the body of the wasp, so taper was the waist and so exuberant was the swell of the bosom. All right. Her mouth was small and pouting, but when she smiled, the parting roses of the lips displayed a set of teeth white as the pearls of the East. Her hand would have made the envy of a queen, and yet above all these charms a certain something which could not be exactly denominated boldness nor effrontery, but which was the very reverse of extreme reserve, immediately struck Richard Markham. I'm worried about Richard. He could not define the fault he had to find with this beautiful woman, and still there was something in her manners which seemed to proclaim that she did not possess the tranquillity and ease of a wife. She appeared to be constantly aiming at the display of the accomplishments of her mind, or the graces of her attitudes. She seemed to court admiration by every word and every motion, and to keep alive in the mind of the baronet the passion with which she had inspired him. She possessed not that confidence and contented reliance upon the idea of unreliable affections which characterize the wife. She seemed to be well aware that no legal nor religious ties connected the baronet to her, and she, therefore, kept her imagination perpetually upon the rack to weave new artificial bonds to cast around him. And as if each action or each word of the baronet severed those bonds of silk and wreathed flowers, she found, Penelope-like, that at short intervals her labors were to be achieved over again. This sounds exhausting. This constant state of mental anxiety and excitement imparted a corresponding restlessness to her body, and those frequent changes of attitude which were originally intended to develop the graces of her person, or allow her lover's eye to catch short glimpses of her, became now a settled habit. Nevertheless, she was a lovely and fascinating woman, and one for whom a young heart would undertake 1,000 sacrifices. By accident, Richard was seated next to Mrs. Arlington upon the sofa. He soon perceived that she was indeed as accomplished as the baronet had represented her to be, and her critical opinions upon the current literature, dramatic novelties, and new music of the day were delivered with judgment and good taste. Richard could not help glancing from time to time in admiration at her beautiful countenance, animated as it now was with the excitement of the topics of discourse, and whenever her large blue eyes met his, a deep blush suffused his countenance, and he knew not what he said or did. Oh, sweet little innocent Richard! I'm so worried about him. Well, what shall we do to amuse ourselves? Said Chichester at the expiration of about an hour, during which coffee had been handed around. Upon my honour, exclaimed the baronet, I am perfectly indifferent. What say you to a game of whist or écarté? Just as you choose, said Chichester carelessly. At this moment the door opened, and a roguish-looking little tiger, a lad of about 14, in a chocolate-coloured livery, with 3 rows of bright-crested buttons down his Prussian jacket, entered to announce another guest. A short, stout, vulgar-looking man about 40 years of age, with a blue coat and brass buttons, buff waistcoat, and grey trousers, entered the room. "Hello, old chap, how are you?" he exclaimed in a tone of most ineffable vulgarity. "Harborough, how are you? Chichester, my tulip, how goes it?" The baronet hastened to receive this extraordinary visitor, and as he shook hands with him, whispered something in his ear. The stranger immediately turned towards Richard, to whom he was introduced by the name of Mr. Augustus Talbot. This gentleman and the baronet then conversed together for a few moments, and Chichester, drawing near Markham, seized the opportunity of observing, "Talbot is an excellent fellow, a regular John Bull, not over-polished, but enormously rich and well-connected. You will see that he is not more cultivated in mind than in manners, but he would go to the devil to do anyone a service, and somehow or another you can't help liking the fellow when once you know him." "Any friend of yours or the baronet's will be agreeable to me," said Richard, "and provided he is a man of honour, a little roughness of manner should be readily overlooked." You speak like a man of the world, and as a man of honour yourself, said Mr. Chichester. Meantime, the baronet and Mr. Talbot had seated themselves, and the Honourable Mr. Chichester returned to his own chair. The conversation then became general. I didn't know you were in town, Talbot, said Mr. Chichester. And I forgot to mention it, observed the baronet. Or rather, said the lady, you meditated a little surprise for your friend, Mr. Chichester. I hope you've been well, ma'am, since I saw you last, that is, the day before yesterday, said Mr. Talbot. You was complaining then of a slight cold, and I recommended a treacle posset and a stocking tied around the throat. And, my dear Talbot, take some liqueur, cried the baronet, rising hastily and purposely knocking down his chair to drown the remainder of Mr. Talbot's observation. But I dare say you didn't follow my advice, ma'am, pursued Mr. Talbot, with the most imperturbable gravity. For my part, I am suffering dreadful with a bad foot. I'll tell you how it were, ma'am. I've got a nasty soft corn on my little toe, and so what must I do but yesterday morning I takes my razor, sharpens it upon the patent strip, and goes for to cut off Master Corn. But instead of cutting the corn, I nearly sliced my toe off, and... Okay, yeah, this guy's not the most cultivated conversationalist. By the way, Diana, has the young gentleman called yet, whom we met the other evening at the opera? Said the baronet, abruptly interrupting this vulgar tirade. Do you mean the effeminate youth whom we dubbed the handsome unknown? Said the enchantress. Yes, he who was so very mysterious, but who seemed so excessively anxious to form our acquaintance. He promised to call some evening this week, answered Diana, and play a game of écarté. He told me that he was invincible at écarté. Écarté is a card game. I'm sure you figured that out, but card game that was very popular in the 19th century. Talking of écarté, let us play a game, said Mr. Chichester, who was sitting upon thorns lest Mr. Talbot should commence his vulgarities again. He's like, please stop talking about your feet. Well, I'll take a hand with pleasure, said this individual. Then turning toward Diana, he added, I will tell you the rest of the adventure about the soft corn another time, ma'am. What a nuisance this is, whispered Chichester to the baronet. The young fellow does stare so. You must give him some explanation or another, hastily replied the baronet, or I'll tell Diana to say something presently that will soothe down matters. The cards were produced, and Mr. Talbot and the Honourable Mr. Chichester sat down to play. Rupert backed the former, and considerable sums in gold and notes were placed on the table. Presently the lady turned toward Richard and said with a smile, Are you fond of écarté? I must venture a guinea upon Mr. Chichester. Sir Rupert is betting against him, and I love to oppose Sir Rupert at cards. You will see how I tease him presently. With these words the enchantress rose and seated herself near Mr. Chichester. Of course Markham did the same, and in a very short time he was induced by the lady to follow her and back the same side which she supported. They've already convinced him to start gambling. Mr. Chichester, however, had a continued run of ill luck and lost every rubber. Richard was thus the loser of about 30 sovereigns. Oh, that's not good. But he was somewhat consoled by having so fair a companion in his bad fortune. He would have suffered himself to be persuaded by her to persist in backing Mr. Chichester, as she positively assured him that the luck must change, had not that gentleman himself suddenly risen, thrown down the cards, and declared that he would play no more. Would you, ma'am, like to take Mr. Chichester's place? Said Mr. Talbot. Mr. Chichester shook his head to the baronet, and the baronet did the same to Diana, and Diana accordingly declined. The card table was therefore abandoned, and Mrs. Arlington, at the request of Sir Rupert, seated herself at the piano. Without any affectation, she sang and accompanied herself upon the instrument in a manner that quite ravished the heart of Richard Markham. Oh, sweet little Richard. Suddenly the entire house echoed with the din of the front door knocker, and almost simultaneously the bell was rung with violence. In a few moments the young tiger announced Mr. Walter Sidney. He was a youth apparently not more than 19 or 20, of middle height and very slim. He wore a tight blue military frock coat buttoned up to the throat, ample black kerseymere trousers, which did not, however, conceal the fact that he was the least thing knock-kneed, and a hat with tolerably broad brims. His feet and hands were small to a fault. His long, light chestnut hair flowed in luxuriant undulations over the collar of his coat, even upon his shoulders, and gave him a peculiarly feminine appearance. His delicate complexion, upon the pure red and white, of which the dark dyes of no beard had yet infringed, wore a deep blush as he entered the room. "Mr. Sidney, you are welcome," said Mrs. Arlington in a manner calculated to reassure the bashful youth. "It was but an hour ago that we were talking of you, and wondering why we had not received the pleasure of a visit. So this is the dude that they saw, what was it, at the opera, I think they said, who said he could not be beaten at écarté." "Madam, you are too kind," replied Mr. Sidney in a tone which sounded upon the ear like a silver bell, so soft and beautiful was its cadence. "I am afraid that I am intruding. I had hoped to find you alone, I mean yourself and Sir Rupert Harborough, and I perceive that you have company." He stammered, became confounded with excuses, and then glanced at his attire as much as to intimate that he was in a walking dress. Both the baronet and Diana hastened to welcome him in such a manner as to speedily place him upon comfortable terms with himself once more, and he was then introduced to Mr. Chichester, Mr. Talbot, and Mr. Markham. The moment the name of Markham was mentioned, the youthful visitor started perceptibly, and then fixed his intelligent hazel eyes upon the countenance of Richard, with an expression of the most profound interest mingled with surprise. Guys, I have a theory. Mr. Chichester made an observation at the same moment, and Sidney immediately afterwards entered with ease and apparent pleasure into a conversation which turned upon the most popular topics of the day. Richard was astonished at the extreme modesty, propriety, and good sense with which that effeminate and bashful youth expressed himself. And even the baronet, who was in reality well informed, listened to his interesting visitor with attention and admiration. Still, there was a species of extreme delicacy in his tastes, as evidenced by his remarks, which bordered at times upon a fastidiousness, if not an inexperience, actually puerile or feminine. At 11:30, supper was served up, and the party sat down to that most welcome and social of all meals. It was truly diverting to behold the manner in which Mr. Talbot fell, tooth and nail, upon the delicacies which he heaped upon his plate. So he was going at his meal. And his applications to the wine bottle were to correspond. Man, this guy's been drinking all night. At one time, he expressed his regret that it was too vulgar to drink half and half, and on another he vented his national prejudices against those who maintained that Perigord pies were preferable to rump steaks, or that claret was more exquisite than port or sherry. Once, when it would appear Mr. Chichester kicked himself under the table, kicked Mr. Talbot under the table, he roared out a request that his soft corn might be remembered. And as his friends were by no means anxious for a second edition of that interesting narrative, especially before Mr. Walter Sidney, they adopted the prudent alternative of conveying their remonstrances to him by means of winks instead of kicks. They took pity on his corns. And after supper, Mr. Talbot insisted upon making a huge bowl of punch in his own fashion, but he found that Mr. Chichester would alone aid him in disposing of it. Probably because it's spiked with liquor. And as for Mr. Walter Sidney, he never appeared to do more than touch the brim of the wine-glass with his lips. In a short time, Mr. Talbot insisted upon practicing his vocal powers by singing a hunting song, and was deeply indignant with his friends because they would not join in the very impressive but somewhat common chorus of fa-de-la-la-la, fa-de-la-la. I don't know what the song is, or I'd sing it. It is impossible to say what Mr. Talbot would have done next, but much to the honor of the baronet, Mr. Chichester and Diana, and equally to this... I think it was horror. Okay. It is impossible to say what Mr. Talbot would have done next, but much to the horror of the baronet, Mr. Chichester, and Diana, and equally to the surprise of Richard Markham and Walter Sidney, he suddenly lost his balance and fell heavily upon the floor. Guys, I'm laughing so hard I can't even read. He suddenly lost his balance and fell heavily upon the floor into a sound sleep simultaneously. He's so drunk and has told so many stories about the corns on his feet and sung hunting songs that now he has passed out on the floor. Richard, what kind of a group have you gotten yourself mixed up with? What a pity, said Mr. Chichester, shaking his head mournfully and glancing down upon the prostrate gentleman, as if he were pronouncing a funeral oration over his remains. This is his only fault, and as it happens every night, it begins materially to disfigure his character. Otherwise, he's an excellent fellow, and immensely rich. At this moment, the eyes of Richard caught those of Walter Sidney. An ill-concealed expression of superlative contempt and ineffable disgust was visible upon the handsome countenance of the latter, and the proud curl of his lip manifested his opinion of the scene he had just witnessed. In a few moments he rose to depart. To Diana he was only coldly polite, to the baronet and Chichester superbly distant and constrained. But towards Markham, as he took leave of him, there was a cordiality in his manner, and a sincerity in the desire which he expressed that they should meet again, which formed a remarkable contrast with his behaviour towards the others. That night slumber seemed to evade the eyes of Richard Markham. The image of Mrs. Arlington and all that she had said, and the various graceful and voluptuous attitudes into which she had thrown herself, occupied his imagination. At times, however, his thoughts wandered to that charming youth, that mere boy, who seemed to court his friendship, and who was so delicate and so fragile to encounter the storms and vicissitudes of that world in whose dizzy vortex he was already found. Nor less did Richard ever and anon experience a sentiment of profound surprise that the elegant and wealthy Sir Rupert Harborough, the accomplished and lovely Diana, and the fastidious Mr. Arthur Chichester should tolerate the society of such an unmitigated vulgarian as Mr. Talbot. That's the end of the chapter. Guys, I have so many theories. I can't wait to find out what happens next.